Imagine Buckingham Palace in the middle of a national crisis. The world outside is changing. Britain is exhausted. The old order is disappearing. And inside one of the most famous palaces on earth, a mother and daughter are facing a decision that neither of them truly wants to make. The mother is Queen Elizabeth, the Queen Mother. The daughter is Princess Elizabeth, the future Queen Elizabeth II. And at the center of the story is a question that sounds almost unbelievable today. What happens when a mother refuses to leave her daughter behind? There is a famous moment associated with the Queen Mother during the Second World War that captures something extraordinary about her personality. When London was being threatened by bombing, there was pressure for members of the royal family to leave the capital. For many people, the obvious answer was simple: get the Queen and the princesses somewhere safer. But the Queen Mother had a different idea. She believed that if ordinary British families were staying in London, the royal family should not simply disappear to safety. That decision would become one of the defining images of her wartime character. But years later, another moment between mother and daughter revealed something much more personal. Because Elizabeth was no longer simply the shy young princess. She was becoming the monarch. And the Queen Mother had to learn that her daughter was no longer someone she could protect in quite the same way. This is the story of a complicated relationship between two extraordinary women, a relationship built on love, duty, tradition, disagreement, and one of the most powerful transformations in modern British history. To understand why Elizabeth sometimes had to ask her mother twice, we first have to understand the woman who raised her. Queen Elizabeth, the Queen Mother, was born Elizabeth Angela Marguerite Bowes, Lyon in 1900. She was not born a queen. In fact, nobody looking at her childhood could have known that she would one day become one of the most recognizable women in the world. She grew up in an aristocratic family, surrounded by privilege, tradition, and the expectations of British society. But her life changed dramatically when she married Albert, Duke of York, the second son of King George V. Albert was shy. He struggled with his speech. He did not expect to become king. His older brother Edward was first in line. For years, the future seemed relatively predictable. Albert would remain the younger royal brother. His wife would remain the Duchess of York. Their daughters, Elizabeth and Margaret, would grow up in the royal family without expecting to inherit the throne. Then everything changed. In 1936, King Edward VI abdicated. Suddenly Albert became King George VI, and his wife became queen. The woman who had never expected to be queen was suddenly standing beside a king who had never expected to rule. It was an enormous responsibility. But the greatest challenge was still ahead. War. When Nazi Germany threatened Britain, the royal family faced a decision that was both practical and symbolic. Should the children be sent away? Should the Queen and princesses leave London? Should the royal family protect itself by moving somewhere safer? From a purely practical perspective, there were strong arguments for leaving. But the Queen Mother reportedly rejected the idea of abandoning London. Her attitude became famous. She wanted to remain with the British people. And when Buckingham Palace itself was bombed, the symbolism became even more powerful. The palace was no longer an untouchable fortress. It was vulnerable, just like the homes of ordinary citizens. Yet the royal family remained. This was not simply about courage. It was about image. The monarchy understood that during wartime, people were watching. If ordinary families were sleeping in shelters, while the royal family escaped to safety, the emotional damage could have been enormous. The Queen Mother understood that. She understood something about public morale that cannot be measured on a spreadsheet. People wanted to see that the people at the top were suffering too. They wanted to know that their leaders understood their fear. And so the Queen Mother became one of the most recognizable symbols of wartime resilience. But here is where the story becomes more interesting. Because behind the public image was a mother, and her greatest concern was not the British Empire. It was her daughters. Elizabeth and Margaret were still young. Their parents wanted to protect them from the dangers of war. Yet at the same time, they wanted to prepare them for the world they were born into. Elizabeth was especially important. She was second in line to the throne. She had been raised to understand duty. She learned discipline. She learned protocol. She learned that being royal was not simply about wearing beautiful clothes or living in palaces. It meant responsibility. It meant sacrifice. And eventually, it would mean becoming queen. But nobody expected that moment to arrive as quickly as it did. In 1952, King George VI died. Elizabeth was only 25. Suddenly, the young woman who had been a daughter became the sovereign. Her entire life changed in a matter of hours. Imagine being 25 years old. Imagine losing your father. And before you have even processed the grief, realizing that millions of people are now looking to you for leadership. That was Elizabeth's reality. And standing behind her was her mother. The Queen Mother had lost her husband. Elizabeth had lost her father. They were grieving the same man, but their lives were now moving in completely different directions. Elizabeth had to move forward. She had to become queen. Her mother had to step back. That transition could not have been easy. For decades, the Queen Mother had been the senior woman in the royal family. She had been the wife of the king. She had been the mother of the future queen. She had been one of the most important figures in Britain. Now her daughter was sovereign. The balance had changed, and this is where their relationship becomes fascinating, because Elizabeth Seppere was famously reserved. She rarely showed emotion publicly. She spoke carefully. She avoided unnecessary drama. She understood that the crown demanded control. The Queen Mother, on the other hand, had a warmer and more openly social personality. She loved conversation. She enjoyed people. She loved fashion. She loved tradition. She had a famously strong personality, and she was also a mother who had spent years looking after Elizabeth. That created an unusual tension. The Queen Mother could advise her daughter. She could offer experience. She could make suggestions. But ultimately, Elizabeth was the queen. There were moments when the Queen Mother had to accept that her daughter was now the one giving the final answer. And sometimes, that answer apparently did not come easily. This is why the idea of Elizabeth having to ask twice becomes so compelling. It represents something bigger than one conversation. It represents the struggle between two identities, mother and daughter, queen and queen mother, past and future, tradition and change. The older generation had shaped the monarchy Elizabeth inherited, but Elizabeth's reign would last for decades, carrying the institution through a completely different Britain. The world of the 1950s was disappearing. The empire was shrinking. The Commonwealth was changing. Television was transforming politics. The public was becoming more skeptical of institutions. The royal family had to adapt, and Elizabeth had to make decisions that her mother might not always have made in the same way. Yet despite disagreements, the relationship between them remained remarkably strong. The Queen Mother never stopped being Elizabeth's mother, and Elizabeth never stopped being her daughter. That is perhaps the most human part of this entire story. Behind the crowns and ceremonies, they were still family. There were birthdays, Christmases, private jokes, family arguments, moments of affection, and moments when one probably wished the other would simply stop talking. Because royalty does not remove ordinary human emotions. It only places them behind palace walls. The Queen Mother also remained deeply popular. After Elizabeth became queen, her mother became a kind of living bridge to the previous generation. She represented continuity. She reminded people of George VI. She represented the wartime years. She was connected to a Britain that had largely disappeared. For Elizabeth, that could be both comforting and complicated. Her mother was a reminder of where she came from. But a monarch cannot live entirely in the past. A queen has to look forward, and Elizabeth's greatest strength may have been her ability to survive that transition. She did not become her mother. She became herself. There is another fascinating element to their relationship. The Queen Mother had once helped shape Elizabeth's understanding of monarchy. Now Elizabeth was the monarch, and her mother had to watch her daughter make decisions that affected the entire institution. Think about the emotional reversal. A mother watches her daughter grow up. She teaches her, protects her, corrects her. Then one day, the daughter becomes the person everyone else must obey. That is not an easy transition for any parent, even without a crown. Now multiply that emotional difficulty by the weight of history. The Queen Mother was not simply watching her daughter become independent. She was watching her become one of the most powerful constitutional figures in Britain. And Elizabeth was not simply trying to establish independence from her mother. She was trying to establish authority while still respecting the woman who had raised her. That required enormous emotional discipline. Elizabeth's solution was often simple. Listen, consider, then decide, and if necessary, ask again, because the Queen Mother could be persuasive. She could be stubborn. She had strong opinions, and she was not afraid to express them. But eventually, there was one person whose decision stood above everyone else's: the Queen. That distinction became increasingly important as Elizabeth's reign continued. The Queen Mother aged. Elizabeth became more experienced. The roles became clearer, and yet the affection remained. When people look at photographs of the two women together, it is easy to focus on the crowns, dresses, ceremonies, and royal surroundings. But look closely at their expressions. Sometimes you can almost forget the titles. You see a mother looking at her daughter, and a daughter looking at her mother. That is what makes their story so powerful, because history often reduces famous people to events: kings, queens, wars, abdications, coronations. But people do not live as historical symbols. They live as human beings. They lose people they love. They argue. They forgive. They worry. They grow older. And they watch their children become people they can no longer protect. The Queen Mother's wartime decision to remain in London became part of her legend. But her relationship with Elizabeth tells us something even more important. Courage is not always about standing in front of danger. Sometimes courage is letting someone you love take responsibility. The Queen Mother had spent much of her life protecting Elizabeth, but eventually she had to let Elizabeth become the person she was destined to be. And Elizabeth had to learn that being a good daughter did not mean always agreeing with her mother. It meant respecting her while accepting her own responsibility. That is an incredibly difficult lesson, and perhaps it is one that many families can understand. Parents spend years telling their children what to do. Then, suddenly, those children become adults. The parent may still think they know best. The child may still hear the parent's voice in their head. But adulthood means making your own decisions. For Elizabeth, that process happened under the most extraordinary circumstances imaginable. She could not simply walk away from responsibility. She had to carry it. For 70 years, she did. And throughout much of that journey, the Queen Mother remained a familiar presence. She lived into her 90s. She became one of the most beloved figures in Britain. Her longevity meant that Elizabeth spent most of her reign with her mother still alive. That is extraordinary when you think about it. The Queen had become one of the oldest and longest serving monarchs in British history. Yet her mother was still there, still advising, still teasing, still watching, still being mum. And perhaps that was the greatest gift the Queen Mother could give her daughter. Not control, not authority, presence. Elizabeth eventually had to say goodbye to her mother in 2002. The Queen Mother died at the age of 101. Just weeks earlier, Elizabeth had lost her younger sister, Princess Margaret. It was an extraordinarily painful period for the Queen. Within a short time, she had lost two of the closest members of her immediate family. The woman who had once guided her through childhood was gone. The woman who had once been the Queen was now only a memory, and Elizabeth was left to continue. That was always the strange reality of being Queen. Personal grief had to coexist with public duty. There could be tears in private, but eventually there was another engagement, another speech, another ceremony, another responsibility. The world kept moving. And perhaps the Queen Mother understood that better than anyone. She had spent her life watching Britain change. She had seen a king abdicate. She had seen her husband become king. She had lived through war. She had seen the empire transform. She had watched her daughter become queen. And eventually, she watched that daughter become an institution in her own right. The young Elizabeth, who once needed protection, had become the woman who needed no one to speak for her. That may be the real meaning behind the story of Elizabeth having to ask twice. It is not really about stubbornness. It is not simply about palace protocol. It is about two women negotiating a relationship in which love and authority existed side by side. The Queen Mother could be difficult. Elizabeth could be firm. But underneath it all was an extraordinary bond. And perhaps that is why their story continues to fascinate people. Because behind the royal titles was something incredibly ordinary. A mother who did not want to let go. And a daughter who eventually had to step forward. So the next time you see an old photograph of Queen Elizabeth II standing beside the Queen Mother, do not just see royalty. See a mother and daughter. See a woman who once held her daughter's hand and later had to watch that daughter carry the weight of a crown. See a daughter who inherited not only a throne, but lessons from the woman who raised her. And remember this, sometimes the hardest thing a parent can do is step aside. Sometimes the hardest thing a child can do is make a decision their parent does not like. And sometimes love survives precisely because both people understand that they cannot remain in the same roles forever. The Queen Mother had her time, Elizabeth had hers, and history remembers them not because they were perfect, but because they endured change without allowing it to destroy the bond between them. If you enjoyed this story and want more fascinating royal history told with the human details that often disappear from the textbooks, make sure you support the channel. Like this video, if it kept you watching, share it with someone who loves royal history, and subscribe so you do not miss the next story, because behind every crown there is a person, and behind every great historical moment there is usually a story we have never been told.